Hello everyone, I'm Nitsa, and it is that time again, full set limited review week. All of Guilds of Ravnica was spoiled yesterday, and I will be releasing a new video every day for the next week and then some, talking about every single card in the set and how I feel they will perform in this limited format. An important caveat to remember is that I'm reviewing all of these cards before we have a chance to play with them, so these are my initial impressions. It is impossible to be perfect on these things, and as a result, at some point after I've drafted this format a bunch, I'll release a video looking back on my set reviews like I always do. Before we get started, if you're new to my set reviews, check out the video in the description below that explains how I grade and what the grades mean. Now, let's jump into the first white card. Our first card is Blade Instructor, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/1 human soldier at common, and it has Mentor. This is a mechanic we're going to see a fair amount of in this video and in the red video, which is the Boros mechanic. And it says, whenever this creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power. A 3-mana 3/1 is nothing to write home about. It can be blocked and killed by just about any creature, but at least it leaves some value behind since it pumps up another attacking creature permanently. Still, there will be enough board states where this is just a 3-mana 3/1 that I don't think the card is that great. I know you'll play it in your white decks, and on games where you can play it on turn 3 after a 2-drop and attack with both the next turn, it's going to feel pretty good, but in the later part of the game, it's just going to get outclassed. I think it's just a solid C. Just filler, basically. Next, we have Bounty Agent, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human soldier at rare. It has Vigilance, and you can tap it and sacrifice it to destroy target legendary permanent that's an artifact, creature, or enchantment. A 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance is usually pretty medium, like a C. This does offer some upside, but since this isn't Dominaria, all the legendary creatures are at higher rarities. As a result, in most games, this won't ever be able to kill things. Still, it's a bear with some upside, and I think that makes it perfectly playable. But I think I'm going to give it a grade as if it didn't have that activated ability, because mostly it's just not going to. I'm giving it a C. Obviously, though, should your opponent play legendary permanent, it will be pretty awesome. Next up, we have Candlelight Vigil, which for 3 generic and a white is an enchantment aura at common. It's an enchant creature. An enchanted creature gets +3/+2 and has Vigilance. This is really bad to me. For me, auras need to do something pretty impressive to be worth the risk, and this just doesn't do that. The stats boost is mediocre for the cost, and adding Vigilance is just about the least impactful keyword you could give to something. This aura is expensive and underwhelming, so it can't overcome the problems that auras always have, opening you up to a 2-for-1. I think this is just an F. I get that the kind of fun thing to do with this is to put it on a creature with Mentor, because then it can mentor more creatures, but I don't think it's worth the risk, even in those cases, and that's why I'm giving it an F. Next, we have Citywide Bust, which for 1 generic and 2 white mana is a rare sorcery, and it says destroy all creatures with toughness 4 or greater. This kind of card is always a little awkward and limited. It will definitely have board states where it shines, and if you are in Selesnya or Boros, which you probably will be since those are the only 2 guilds that have white in them in this set, both decks where most creatures on your side can survive the effect, I think this can actually be pretty nice if you're in those colors. I mean, even if you just kill one of your opponent's creatures with it, that's fine. More than that is great. That said, you just can't rely on this always doing something. 2 of the 5 guilds in the set, as I've already mentioned, won't be harmed by this a whole lot. I think this is decent in your main board, something like a C, though there will be matchups where it's an F and you should side it out, and others where it's a B. It's just very dependent on what your opponent is doing. Next, we have Collar the Culprit, which for 3 generic and 1 white is a common instant, and it says destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater. Basically, a worse version of Citywide Bust in most ways. Collar the Culprit is okay. You can't always guarantee it will have a target, but most people will have 5 or so targets for it, I would guess, in their deck. And that means you can play it main board, but it is still too situational to be especially good. I think most of the time you cut this and maybe bring it out of your sideboard. I'm giving it a C-. Next, we have Conclave Tribunal, which for 3 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment. It has Convoke, which is the Selesnya mechanic, and that says your creatures can help cast this spell. Each creature you tap while casting this spell pays for 1 generic or 1 mana of that creature's color. When Conclave Tribunal enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Conclave Tribunal leaves the battlefield. This is an incredible card. If this didn't have Convoke, it would be a premium removal spell. With Convoke, it pushes into the upper echelons of power level for uncommons in this set. Being able to hit any permanent for 4 mana is already good, and doing it for less, sometimes, thanks to Convoke, is enough to push this all the way up to a B+. It's one of the best uncommons in the set, the kind that you take over about 90% of the rares and mythics. Next, we have Crush Contraband, which for 3 generic and a white is an uncommon instant, and it says choose one or both. Exile target artifact, exile target enchantment. Obviously, this is a sideboard card in a format like this. There are an average number of enchantments in this set, but this set is far below average on artifacts. They had to make room for all those multicolor cards, you know? As a result, I don't think you ever want to play it main board, but the fact that it can actually blow up both an artifact and an enchantment, potentially giving you a 2-for-1, makes it a nice sideboard card. I mean, I guess you could play it main board, and if you do, it's probably like a D. There just aren't going to be enough targets for it in your average game, but maybe you'll get lucky. Most of the time, though, I think you bring it out of the sideboard, and it's probably like a B- from there. Next, we have Dawn of Hope, which for 1 generic and 1 white is a rare enchantment, and it says whenever you gain life, you may pay 2 generic. If you do, draw a card, and then for 3 generic and a white, it can create a 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink. This is my kind of card. It's a grindy value engine, and I'm always happy to play those. It just fits my own play style. The nice thing about a card like this is that while it certainly gets better if you have other ways to gain life lying around, of which there are several in this set, it gets better, but it isn't useless if you don't get enough ways to gain life, since it provides a source of life gain all its own in the form of the lifelink soldier tokens. That said, this is clunky, and while it turns into an incredible mana sink in the late game, it isn't going to be very good in the early game most of the time. I'm really tempted to say this is worth taking with a first pick because I like it so much, but I think I'm going to err on the side of caution in the early going of this format and say it's something like a C+, something worth taking kind of early, but not in the first few picks. Next we have Demotion, which for 1 white mana is an enchantment aura at uncommon. It has enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature can't block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. This card's interesting. I think it's dangerous to think of this as a straight-up removal spell for some decks, since the creature can still attack. But for really aggressive decks, this will sometimes allow you to really open the floodgates by making your opponent's best creature unable to block. There are also a boatload of mana sink activated abilities in this format, and turning those off is a nice bonus. That said, sometimes what you'll really need is a way to actually keep a creature from attacking you, and this just doesn't do that. But for 1 mana, I think it does enough to be solid. I don't think this card's great, but I think you play the first copy in basically any white deck in this format, and I'm giving it a C. Next, we have Divine Visitation, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a mythic rare enchantment. If 1 or more creature tokens would be created under your control, that many 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance are created instead. This is one of those build-around cards that have an insanely high ceiling but a terrible floor. If your deck can't make tokens, steer clear. The good news, though, is that most decks running white in this format will be making some tokens, and Selesnya decks especially will crank them out like crazy. However, I do think it deserves an F in your typical deck in this format, and like a B+ in a deck that has 6 or 7 or more ways to make tokens. It's worth noting that upgrading your tokens doesn't quite give you a full card worth their value. You're just making your spells more efficient, essentially. You're not actually getting a whole extra card usually. However, if you trigger this twice or play a card that makes 2 tokens at once, you're going to be in pretty great shape. I think this may have a high enough ceiling to consider taking with pack 1, pick 1 in a pack that doesn't have a lot of good removal or bombs, and it doesn't look like it will be super difficult to build around this card. We're going to see several ways to make tokens in this video, and we've already seen one actually, and I think it's something like a B+ in that deck, and as a result, I do think it's a little risky, but maybe first picking this will be worth it. We'll see. Next, we have Flight of Equinox, which is a 7 generic mana and 1 white, 4/5 human knighted uncommon. That's expensive, right? But it has Convoke, and it has Flying. This is going to be a nice finisher for both guilds that have white, Boros and Selesnya, though I think it will be best in Selesnya because they are a bit better at making a bunch of tokens to power this out, and they also have access to green ramp, which could get it out even sooner. I think if you can cast this by convoking 2 creatures, you'll feel fine about it, and once you get below that, to where you are paying 5 mana for this 4/5 flyer, you start to get pretty excited. And it isn't far-fetched to see this coming down on turn 5. All you need to have in play is 3 creatures and 5 mana. All of that makes this pretty good, but I do think it falls a little short of first pickable. I'm giving it a C+. Next, we have GERD for Battle, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon sorcery that says put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. So the first time I read this card, I thought it was an instant. In fact, not even just the first time. I read it multiple times because I actually made this whole video and was editing it and noticed it was a sorcery. So don't make that mistake. This is a sorcery, and that makes it a lot worse than it would be if it were an instant. It's going to fit well into a deck that has tokens. You can make a couple of them bigger, etc. But a lot of the time, I don't really think that's going to be worth a whole card at sorcery speed. I think most of the time, you just don't play this unless your deck is really desperate for some playables. There aren't +1/+1 counter payoffs really in this format, and that makes it a lot less worse than it would otherwise be. I think it's just a D. Next, we have Hawes de Marshall, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 human soldier at uncommon. Whenever it and at least 2 other creatures attack, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink. So, battalion, basically. This is a great play on turn 1, especially if you can quickly populate the board, and obviously fits nicely into both Boros and Selesnya decks. In Boros, because it is just a pure aggro deck, and in Selesnya, because of tokens and Convoke. Still, like a lot of 1-drops, its usefulness drops off considerably as the game goes on. You just won't be able to attack with it from mid-game on unless you mentor it several times, which obviously is the dream. I think its limitations keep it from being anything more than a C, though. A nice 1-drop for your white decks that sometimes might get a little out of hand with the help of Mentor, but most of the time he won't do as much as you're imagining. Next we have Healer's Hawk, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 bird at common and has flying and lifelink. Normally, I'm not super excited about 1 mana 1/1 flyers. They don't represent a real threat and they get quickly outclassed, but this one comes with lifelink too, and that makes it a little better. However, what I think actually makes this a reasonable card in this format is all the creatures with Mentor running around. This is an absolutely excellent place to put a +1/+1 counter or two, as coupled with the evasiveness and lifelink, it will become really hard for your opponent to best you in any type of race. Still, I don't think you play this unless your deck has a decent amount of creatures with Mentor. I think it's like a C- in your average white deck and a C+ in a deck with a lot of Mentor cards. Next we have Hunted Witness, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 human at common, and when it dies, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink. A 1 mana 1/1 that replaces itself with a creature sees some uses in limited. Unfortunately, the token this makes doesn't fly or sacrifice itself to add mana like successful 1 mana 1/1s that make 1/1 tokens when they die that we've seen in the past. Additionally, this set isn't exactly loaded with reasons to sacrifice creatures, especially in white. If it were, this would be considerably better. As it stands, I'm not a huge fan of this. Sure, yeah, it's a 1-drop that you can mentor. That's what people are going to constantly say about all these 1-drops. Yes, that's true of all of them. But I'm still not that impressed. I think you avoid playing this most of the time. I think it just gets cut, and I think it's a D+. Next, we have Inspiring Unicorn, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a 2/2 unicorn at uncommon, and whenever it attacks, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a powerful uncommon. Note that unlike some other creatures like it we've seen in the past, it actually pumps itself too, so if it's attacking, it's a 3/3. Pumping your whole team is a potent effect, and the Boros deck, which looks to be all about curving out, and the Selesnya deck, as we've said, looks to be about going wide and making tokens, will both be ecstatic about having this. One thing it doesn't have going for it, and it is relevant in a set with lots of fixing where it's easy to splash, is that it isn't easy to splash because of the whole double white thing. But that's minor downside, and I'm actually pretty glad they didn't make this easily splashable, because that would be kind of a nightmare. I think because white decks in this format are going to have so many creatures, this will always make the cut, and you're going to be pretty happy to get multiples. I think it's a B-. I think it's worth taking with your first pick. Next we have Intrusive Pack Beast, which for 4 generic and a white is a 3/3 beast at common. It has vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, tap up to 2 target creatures your opponents control. This is a solid creature for the white decks in this format that are all going to be fairly aggressive, I think. Decks that curve out and then play this on turn 5, tapping down your opponent's 2 best blockers, could just win on the spot. Of course, that's what it does in the ideal scenario. Sometimes it will just be an inefficient creature whose ability doesn't really do anything. This is the kind of card you might have to keep in mind when deciding how to attack someone who's playing white, and it is worth noting that it has some usability even in the late game. I mean, sometimes it'll actually do something in the late game, but a lot of the time it just won't. It's kind of a weird card in that you can't just say, like, it's always going to give you value in the late game, because sometimes tapping down 2 creatures won't matter if you're far enough behind on board. I think it makes the cut, the first copy, at least in most white decks, and I think it's a solid C. Next we have Ledev Guardian, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/4 human knight at common, and it has Convoke. This is kind of a weird use of Convoke. A 4 mana 2/4 is like a D- on its own. Not unplayable, but kind of close. Adding Convoke to it does help out some, but I mean, playing this on turn 3 instead of 4 isn't going to set the world on fire. I think you really only play this if you're short on playables, and maybe it is a good sideboard card against decks with lots of X2s. It's also not a terrible creature to be mentoring, but I'm going to start it at D+. Next we have Light of the Legion, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 5/5 angel at rare. It has flying, it has mentor, and when it dies you put a +1/+1 counter on each white creature you control. A 6 mana 5/5 flyer is already good stats. It adds 2 really nice abilities with Mentor and the ability to pump your white creatures permanently when it dies. Adding those makes this a bomb. Since it can not only threaten the opponent on its own, it can help your smaller creatures get bigger, either through mentoring them or pumping them when it dies. That's a great card, and one that you first pick in just about any scenario unless you end up with a double rare pack that has an even better bomb, and those are few and far between, so the probability there isn't very high. I'm giving this an A-. Next, we have Loxodon Restorer, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 3/4 Elephant Cleric at common. It has Convoke, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. This is not the most exciting thing to cast using Convoke. A 3/4 body isn't a body people will fear in most cases, and while gaining 4 life is fine, especially since this can probably do an okay job blocking, and it might even help you stabilize, but it's not incredible. The way I like to think about all these cards with Convoke, especially the higher converted mana cost ones, is like, well, how much mana do I have to pay for this to feel like I'm getting a good deal? And I think the answer is 4. 4 mana, 3/4 that gains you 4 when it comes into play, and I don't think that's super far-fetched. I think that's a nice rate to be paying for this, but the problem is you're just not going to be able to do that a lot of the time. Sometimes it's just better to attack with your creatures and power this out. Sometimes you can't really afford to tap down your creatures, and he's just not a great enough payoff for really being, trying to Convoke him out. But he's solid. He's a perfectly reasonable card to play. I'm just saying he's not the kind of Convoke payoff like that can win you the game, basically. I'm just going to give him a C. Next up, we have Luminous Bonds, which for 2 generic and a white is an enchantment aura. At common, it has enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature can't attack or block. This is, roughly, the 1000th time we've seen this card, and it's always good. One of white's best commons. Obviously, long gone are the days of getting this effect for only 2 mana, but at 3, it's still a really great card. Sure, it doesn't shut down creatures with activated or static abilities that are problematic. If your opponent has enchantment removal, things could get ugly, but most of the time it will do what you need it to, make a creature irrelevant. This is a premium removal spell and a first pickable common. I'm giving it a B-. Next, we have Hellion Patrol, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/3 human knight with flying and vigilance, and it has Mentor. A 4 mana 2/3 with vigilance is already a pretty decent deal. If that's all this was, it would probably be a C-. I think adding Mentor to this gives it some value. It is clear they put a lot of 1/1s in red and white that this can mentor, and when it starts making +1/+1 counters, that's where this can really pull you ahead. Like all mentor creatures, if it gets mentored, it can start mentoring bigger stuff too. How many times can I say mentor in one video, by the way? Anyway, I think this is a solid playable for any white deck, and I'm giving it a C. Next, we have Righteous Blow, which for 1 white mana is a common instant, and it says Righteous Blow deals 2 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. This is an okay removal spell, though it being so situational is kind of annoying. The creature has to be small, and it has to be attacking or blocking. Still, you'll be able to trade up with this card pretty frequently since it only costs 1 mana, and that's what makes it solid. But I think it is the kind of removal spell that is easily cut in exchange for the more powerful ones that we've already seen. I think it's just a C. Next, we have Rock Charger, which for 2 generic and a white is a 1/3 bird at uncommon. It has flying, and whenever it attacks, target attacking creature without flying gains flying till end of turn. We more or less just had this card at common in the form of Pegasus Charger 2 formats in a row, and it was good both times. This is very, very slightly different in the sense that it can only give creatures without flying. The weird thing about Pegasus Charger is you can target a creature with flying. Pegasus Charger was a really good common and now a really good uncommon, basically. It is worth noting that this will probably help mentoring be a little less risky in this format. Giving another creature flying every attack is really nice in terms of damage, even without mentor, and obviously this can be mentored by any creature with mentor because they all have 2 power or more. I'm going to give this the grade I gave Pegasus Charger in the last 2 formats, a C+. It's a high quality uncommon, but I don't think in an ideal world you're first picking it. Though it's pretty close, and maybe in an incredibly weak pack this is something you could take. Next we have Skyline Scout, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/1 human scout at common, and whenever it attacks you can pay 1 generic and a white, and if you do, it gains flying until end of turn. 2 mana 2/1 is usually like a D, but this one has the added ability to gain flying if you have some extra mana laying around. It isn't super exciting, but it fills the 2-drop slot and works well with Mentor because of its evasiveness. I think it's the kind of filler 2-drop that you play most of the time, and that's pretty classic definition of a C. Next we have Sonhome Stalwart, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human soldier at uncommon. It has First Strike and it has Mentor. A 2 mana 2/2 with First Strike is already a pretty good card. That would probably be a C+. First Strikers both block and attack well since they can make combat such a nightmare for anything with low toughness. Adding Mentor to this is very nice, and while it has low power, there's enough 1/1s around for it to be mentoring things, and it's also a great creature to mentor because First Strike gets better the more power you have. So overall, I think this is a very, very good uncommon. I think it's another one that's first pickable. I think it's a B-. Next, we have Sworn Companions, which for 2 generic and a white is a common sorcery, and it says create 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink. We've seen versions of this card before, but in the past it didn't actually make lifelink creatures. Additionally, Selesnya and Boros decks are both on board with this because both Mentor and Convoke want you to have plenty of creatures lying around. Making 2 tokens is good on turn 3 and often fine in the late game too, as it either provides you with a couple of chump blockers who gain you life, or helps you go wide enough to kill your opponent. I think you play this in basically all white decks in this format, but it isn't the kind of card that you're excited about in most cases. It's basically filler. I'm giving it a C. Next, we have Take Heart, which for 1 white mana is a common instant that says target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. You gain 1 life for each attacking creature you control. This is another nice trick for white. 1 mana for +2/+2 usually plays pretty well. It can help your creature win a lot of combats. Adding the life gain to it is some nice additional value. It has the problem all tricks have. You open yourself up to 2-for-1s if you're not careful, but it's a 1 mana trick, so that risk is a little less painful. It's a solid C. Next, we have 10th District Guard, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human soldier at common. And when 10th District Guard enters the battlefield, target creature gets +0/+1 until end of turn. A 2 mana 2/2 these days is usually something like a D+ or a C-. This adds an enter the battlefield trigger that is basically irrelevant. It's super underwhelming. Occasionally, maybe 1 out of 5 times you cast this, it'll enable an attack you didn't have before. Most of the time, I don't think it really does anything. For that reason, I don't really think this gets out of the C- range. You're going to cut this pretty frequently. There are a lot of better 2-drops out there. And our last white card is Venerated Loxodon, which for 4 generic and a white is a 4/4 elephant cleric at rare. It has Convoke, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that convoked it. A 5 mana 4/4 is obviously nothing special, but it won't be hard to cast this with Convoke and get like 1 +1/+1 counter. So if you're playing this as a 4 mana card and convoking with one thing, you're already getting some pretty good value. You're getting a 4/4 and a +1/+1 counter, so you're getting 5/5 total out of the 5 mana you spent. And that's like a reasonable scenario for this card. That's not a crazy one, like maybe you play 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, and then you drop this on turn 4 and you pump all of those creatures. That, that's kind of magical Christmas land, but it's not insane or impossible for that to happen. Overall, I think this card is really strong between having decent stats and being easy to cast with Convoke and pumping them all, and I'm giving it a B. I think you first picked this in a lot of packs. That does it for this first video of my Guilds of Ravnica full set limited review. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with the things I said or the grades I gave some of these cards. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more of my content, which includes tomorrow the full set limited review for blue. Thanks for watching.